well, bear with me. I'm a professor, so I've been a professor for many years, so whenever I get a chance to talk to an audience, I can't stop. So I tend to go on and on and on and get really technical, even though, but trust me, this is the best way to fall asleep. So if you fall asleep, if you ever had problem falling asleep, come to my lectures. Okay, so anyway, so I went through all this trouble to get a good sample. I want to see, this is what a sample looks like, and it represents the kind of density of the population, and findings, very quickly on the findings. So the prevalence of the problem. This is probably the very first study in the US and actually get some number based on a representative sample of the undocumented migrants in San Diego County on the prevalence of the problem. So if you count all the categories, if you check yes, it gets counted, it's about 58% of the sample experience some forms of trafficking violations. Abusive or trafficking violations. And if you want to separate these two out, those with trafficking violations is about 31% of my sample. Keep in mind, that's a representative sample, so that implies you could extract that to apply for the larger population. And for the other categories, just abusive labor practice, the deceptions and frauds, throw them all together, it's about 55%. And here's a more interesting chart to look at, is the concentrations of where you are likely to find the most abuses. Originally, my thought was probably in agriculture, because agriculture tends to hire people who are the most illiterate, most unfamiliar with the U.S. environment, work laws and protections and all that stuff, and therefore they're probably more vulnerable to all kinds of abuses. Not true. Agriculture was actually one of the lowest economic sectors that I found abuses. Most abuses we found were in construction, landscaping, janitorial services, cleaning services, and food processing, as well as manufacturing industries. Not agriculture. Agriculture as an economic sector, relative to all the others, has the lowest labor trafficking violations. Okay, I want to stop here because we have a lot to cover, and I was told that I did not allow any chance for you to do Q&As. So we will move into the next section. I guarantee you there will be more Q&As happening. All right, so we're going to move to the next presentation. We have a lot of materials to cover.
So, as promised, we go back to, I think I shared this with somebody, like during the transition. I think I'm like a smuggler. I have no idea how math works. So, that's why I left the math to the professor, right? Because, I do the same thing. 2 y 3 son 6? Yeah, sure. We'll do it that way. So now we move to, in fact, what several of you have been, the theme that several of you have been raising. Like, what about all of these interactions that we are witnessing? Because, again, they are not separate businesses. And I think all of us can agree on that. We are seeing collaborations, we're seeing interactions, we are seeing all of these intersections between the markets. So we are going to be, now we're moving into this exploration, like how do we know that this occurs, we know that it happens. So going back to trying to connect and trying to build what we see, what we witness, or what you as practitioners, as people who are out here, how do you see these connections and how do we make sense of them? Because here, again, we go back to the point where we started this morning. How do we make the connections? How is people who work on intelligence analysis, how do we put all of this information together to make sense, to going on to policymakers? Oh, this is fancy. So, what do they share? And here we go back to you. What are some of the points that you see that they share in common?
I already looked at it like,
like what are some of the factors that you see that they have, that both kinds of organizations have in common? Drug trafficking organizations or human smuggling organizations? Yes.
Their networks are complex. They're not necessarily linear. So it involves a series of relationships with different people.
Okay. Networks. So that is one of the level of interaction. Thank you. Anyone else?
The routes.
The routes. So, who can see that, who has been able to witness that? The use of the several, yes, so I see several of you nodding. So there is, as, we are sharing, the organization share the border. In fact, we do share the border with, as people who live here. They do rely on the same routes. They do rely on, some of the same services. They go and talk to several of the same people. Anything else?
They're basically both transport agencies, just that have a different cargo.
Perfect. So we are looking at organizations that rely on the border, on the existence of the border, to facilitate their own trade. Anything else?
Plazas.
Plazas. Could you expand a little bit on the plazas?
Well, you got to get over the border, and that's set up, and who owns that plaza? The fair piece.
So we see this, we get to see this a lot, again on the routes, right? Where people have to go, and if you are working with the smugglers, where they go, oh, I have to deposit this money at this little capillita, at this little church, at this little setting where I can go and leave the money for the smuggler, because what happens if I don't pay the mafia, the mafia or the trafficking organization that is controlling that route? I'll be in a little bit of trouble, right? Just so say the least. So there's the derecho de piso, the piso, the pizzo, from the mafias that we were just discussing also in Italy a few weeks ago. So any other trend that you may see, what they share in common, along the U.S.-Mexico border, the southwestern corridor? I think those are, in very general terms, some of the ways that we can see. The sharing of the territory, sharing of the connections and the services that some organizations do share. And of course, there is a hierarchy in terms of who gets to use the routes. If I'm sure that you have heard this, when again, you can use the route on this day, or you cannot, or the people, right? When people say we were staying at the stash houses for 3 weeks, not 3 weeks, but for several days, 3-4 days, because la mafia está buscando el camino. Or, los señores estaban usando el camino. There was an order that came that route couldn't be used. Is that, has that been the experience of people here in the room? Okay. So there are, what we see, this is what we see on the ground. So right now I am going to let, the professor take over again, but I'm training him. So, and we're just going to go over what does the literature say? What does the research say about this collaboration?
Okay, what I'm about to say can be controversial, not controversial in the sense in political sense, but maybe controversial in the experiential sense. That what you see is different from what I see here. Keep that in mind, as I have the luxury of not having to deal with the problems that you're dealing with. So I don't care about the consequences of what I see. You do. You have the consequences you have to deal with. Those of you who wear uniforms, you have problems you have to solve. There are different ways of looking at organized crime, whether it's human smuggling or drug trafficking. You can look at it structurally, whether there's a hierarchy, there's a power structure. There's some decision must be made, and that reflects the power of the individuals in that network. And also, you can look at it as a network, so people using resources to pull the relatives and friends into it, or you can view it as an enterprise. It's a business. In other words, transactions need to be made, money need to be paid, and how money gets moved around. All these things are different ways of looking at organized crime. What I want to introduce is to look at organized crime in terms of whether they are territorial-based or non-territorial-based. And it has a lot of consequences in how we understand violence down the line. Okay. Territorial-based organized crime. And we look at the Italian Mafia, the Sicilian Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, the Hong Kong Triads, and all these are traditional criminal organizations that are territorially based. They have a clear boundaries of their territory. They're locally based, they have neighborhoods, and there's certain blocks that are within their influence, and you do not want any competition from other rival gangs or rival criminal organizations. And it tends to be self-perpetuating. It goes on and on, generational. And then they relied on official corruption and the threat of violence. All these things conduct their business. And then there's a tendency towards a monopoly. In other words, if I control this neighborhood, this is my hood, I have the total say of what's going on in this territory. And you do not want to come in. If you come in, there's going to be trouble. Non-territorial, those transnational organized crime, they tend to be short-term projects, mostly task force oriented, involving entrepreneurs who have resources and connections one way or another. And rules and regulations are mostly set by participants who have the resources, who bring the resources into the enterprise, as opposed to have a mafia boss at the time. This is how you do it. That's the rule of my organization. And the activities in transnational organized crime is mostly coordinated through individuals manning specialized tasks. They use official corruptions also, but mostly it's a group of entrepreneurs who got together. And what about identity and the membership? Identity in a traditional criminal organization tends to be highly solidified through cultural practices. You identify with a group. And also there are rituals, the time-honored traditions and rituals to become part of the membership. And usually membership is a lifetime. So once you become a member of the Italian Mafia, and whether it's in New York or Boston or Chicago, you are a member forever. And it tends to be multi-generational. You have the boss and transfer to the children and the relatives and uncles and cousins, where non-territorial organized crime, it's temporary, it's transient, and there are no formal rituals. There's certainly no formal culture revolving around any specific organization. And membership is mostly transient and operational. And there's no discussions of the loyalty. Okay, the role of violence, and this is where it gets really tricky, because I think it has a lot to do with whether you're a territorial-based gang or criminal organization or you're non-territorial. Violence in the context of organized crime, when we study violence and organized crime, we always view violence as instrumental. In other words, violence, unlike the street crimes, you have murders, murders, assaults, aggravated assaults, and these things. There's a lot of emotional or expressive element in the use of violence. So you use violence to express frustrations, hate, love, whatever. That has emotional purpose in that violence. However, in the context of organized crime, violence is always instrumental. It's used to solve some specific predicaments, to enforce a contract, to eliminate competitions, to take out snitches, so on and so forth, or to resolve intergroup conflicts. If you entrenches upon my territory, I will use violence. I'll probably use threat first, then use actual violence to get rid of you. Violence in non-territorial organized crime also can be used to enforce contract and to coerce client cooperation, in other words, during the smuggling process. And violence is used to compel people to comply with the group of the rule and to maintain control during the smuggling and trafficking operations. So this brings up the issue that I really want to get you involved, is that why there's just so much violence happening in certain areas. Is it really the fight between different drug trafficking cartels? I'm talking about Mexico now. Is it because there are different trafficking cartels vying for a specific neighborhood or vying for specific trafficking routes? If you consider transnational organized crime, in this case from Latin America through Mexico into US, considers a long series of connected events, then the business is mostly conducted with people who only know one another. In other words, it's a point-to-point, what I call the dyadic transaction. I know you, I send a shipment to you, you pay me. It's never a shared activity. And if that's the case, why is violence necessary? Why is violence so widespread? I mean, it was in the mid and late 90s in Ciudad Juarez and also in Tijuana and other parts of the Mexican cities. Is it really as what the Government reports and the news media reports indicate that the different drug cartels are fighting over trafficking routes or something else. I don't have an answer. I'm throwing that out to you. Yes.
Part of a TCO, a Mexican TCO owning a plaza requires them to have a relationship with certain individuals that have some type of influence within a plaza. So, for example, a municipal police chief or a municipal mayor. Those are sort of necessities for a person to project dominance in a particular plaza. So, part of the reason that TCOs fight not only is the route, but what is required to enable them to move through a route or through a particular area is having that relationship with, say, in this example, a police chief or a mayor. You need to have that relationship. So if you have two entities that are sort of, paying, you're paying, and the other person's, they're competing for that relationship, then you're going to have that conflict. And that's what I've seen, at least in my experience looking at the networks. It's about trying to coerce, corrupt, or entice another person to work for you to enable you to move your product to a particular area.
Others? Does that sound like representative of law, what you have seen in your line of work?
I would say there's almost even though we're talking about transnational criminal organizations, there is a territorial aspect to it. They may be moving cocaine from Colombia all the way to Chicago, but it's through specific routes. Now, the routes can vary as pressure is applied, but there is a territorial aspect to it in those specific key points, which we generally have defined now as plazas, that areas through which they have to go, they have to transit. So I don't see how you can get away from a territorial aspect to this particular problem. Drugs, moving commodities, humans or illicit drugs.
Yeah, so to capitalize on that, I mean, I think so. Violence used as a manner to set operational conditions which are favorable to whatever their end state is. You know, and I don't think it's going to be as easy as saying it's this or that. They look at the operational environment, they look at the market, just like everybody else is, and they're using violence to set conditions which in the end are going to be profitable to them. And that's why you see a lot of these nuevo generations, new generation, things like that popping up. You know, it is somewhat trying to access points to get into the market, and that may be plazas. Those shift depending on shifting populations, depending on shifting economics and stuff like that, where traffic coming in that, you know, if you look at the ports and you look at the illicit cargo, all that other stuff comes in there too. So I don't know if you're going to get a simple explanation of it. I think at the end, it's no different than any other business out there where you got to set conditions in order to maximize profit.
Right.
And I think that's exactly what they're using violence for, is a quick way to get at that.
What I see is that violence is most common in the context of organized crime when there's a turf issues. When there's a territory you have to protect. Violence you can use to discipline members of your group or to get rid of competition. The two things. And internally, you discipline your members, and externally, you get rid of your rivals. And that all implies there's a territory, there's a turf. So violence is only worth when there's some turf issue is at stake. However, if you're just involved in transporting things, if you consider drugs as something you have to conceal, you do not transport it with an opened container, why do I need to pay any turf protections? I mean, what I don't understand is what I'm arguing, I'm just throwing this out to you, is that what I'm arguing is that Mexico probably has more of a distribution issue as opposed to a trafficking issue when it comes to violence. In other words, until the distribution territories can be sorted out, violence will not stop. I have to control this territory. If you want to deal drugs in my territory, you need to pay me. If you want to send stuff through my territory, you need to pay me. But for transporting purposes, why do I need to? I mean, I assume these trafficking routes are secretive. We don't tell people. I don't go out to a cop, hey, I have a shipment coming through. I mean, but if you were, just say, if you're the corrupt cop, why can't I just collect money? Okay, you want to come through my checkpoint? Yeah, pay me a month. Okay. I don't really care who wants to transport through my checkpoint, as long as you pay me.
But you're not taking into consideration warehousing issues and the cellular structure of the trafficking routes.
Right.
Makes it a territory.
Then that's a distribution issue. So in other words, what I'm sensing is maybe that's a growth of a distribution network inside. It's a maturation of the drug market as opposed to a fight between different cartels for the trafficking routes. The drugs will eventually reach U.S. one way or another. The actual routes, I assume drug cartels do not share with one another. Hey, I'm trafficking through here, you're there, I take care of this route, you don't traffic. It's all secretive. I conceal my merchandise in a special compartment inside this tractor trailer and ship through, and if any cost needs to be paid, I'll pay along the way and get through this. I do not need to really get into a fight with anybody unless I have to use a distribution network that is neighborhood-based, turf-based. And that's where the trouble starts. That's my thought. I don't know. It just makes, when there's talk about fighting over trafficking routes between different cartels, just makes no sense to me. I think, why do you have to fight if you're doing this in secretive?
But the way you expand your control or expand your business is to take over other routes. So if you've got...
Unless I share with you my routes, how would you know which routes I'm transporting things? Unless I have to use your warehouse, that's an issue. Unless I have to use your warehouse and use that warehouse as a transshipment operation.
You control whites, and I control, say Nogales, but I'll expand into whites. So I'll come to you and say, hey, I would like to send X number of kilos through whites. I'll pay you. I want my guy there, though, to understand, to see what your routes are, what your connections are. I start learning that, and then I start encroaching upon taking out some of your guys so that I can start moving into your area.
My argument is unless that information is shared publicly with other trafficking groups, which makes the location a relevant point, otherwise, what is it worth fighting for?
The psychological makeup of a lot of the traffickers is such that you start gaining power, and that power becomes very corruptive, and you can get dissed very easily, and you've got the connections into law enforcement, the Mexican law enforcement, that allows you impunity. So you can start doing things, you can start killing people, you can start doing all sorts of things with impunity, and that creates a monster.
Right.
That guy is not secret. People know who he is.
I agree.
He doesn't sit around sitting in his little. He's driving the big Humvee. He's driving the Ford 350 with all the bells and whistles. People know who he is. He wants people to know who he is. So it's not secret. It's a very open.
Oh, sorry.
How much time do I have? I want you to tell me. Yes, go ahead.
Essentially, you don't settle squabbles or disputes with the justice system.
There has to be some squabbles, disputes. Right.
Thus, Zetas, and all the other law enforcement arms that are called for whoever, respectively. Therefore, at some point, you got to settle scores, however you do it, and make a statement that, whether it be a torture, whether it be a killing, that if you mess in my territory, my product, etc., there are consequences. So it's, I think you referred to it earlier, it's just a matter, it's business.
Yeah.
Not personal, it's business.
No, it's instrumental.
And
right.
George Grayson talks about the shadow government versus
Mm-hmm.
the true government. And you got a plaza, you got a plaza boss, but then you got the mayor, presidente.
Right. That's what my argument is. I think what we're witnessing as a result of all the violence, what we're witnessing is the maturation or growth of a distribution network within Mexico. Not so much of a fighting over trafficking routes. Drugs will land in the U.S. And the trafficking itself, to me, in other words, the movement of drugs is always secretive. Unless that information is shared, unless I have to use your distribution network, then that becomes relevant. So in other words, there's an issue between territorial versus non-territorial. If I'm merely driving stuff through your territory, you don't need to know. You're not going to check every drug trucks that come in through your territory. But if I want to use your distribution, transshipment centers, warehouse, then that becomes relevant because I own this territory. Anybody uses any services in this territory has to pay me a fee. That's how territorial organized crime works. So what I'm
things that allows you to own that territory is the intelligence network you have that says when I'm trying to move through your network without paying.
exactly.
And when I try to do that,
Yep.
you're not gonna say, oh well, that's okay, don't worry about it. No,
Right.
you're gonna take action.
My folks will, send tentacles out there. You're using my services, going through my territory, you need to pay me. So now what I'm arguing is there's we should be paying more attention to the significant growth of territorial-based organized crime within Mexico as opposed to fighting over trafficking routes. It's the base where previously, before a long time ago, nobody cares. You send stuff over, you pay some checkpoint corrupt cops, and then you send your stuff through. But now, because the growth of the territorial-based organized crime, they have turfs now. So anything goes through, anything happening on my turf, you need to pay a fee. And that's where trouble starts. Then is where violence is worth. Yeah, so I'm just thinking there's different ways of looking at this. But I want to move to the next one about the discussions over the nexus between organized crime and terrorist groups. I'm not sure to what extent you've been asked to look for terrorist groups amongst organized crime groups and so on and so forth. What I want to present is my views as to how these two groups, yes, they could possibly collaborate, but that collaboration, that overlap, is probably mostly or purely accidental as opposed to intentional. The reason I'm arguing for that is that for any organized crime to exist, especially territorial-based organized crime group, if you want to be stable, run your business in this town, there's usually, as a reflection of the three things. One is that there's some structural deficiencies. Organized crimes emerges can fulfill the function, so that social structure. And second, there's some fringe demands, like demands that you cannot be met by legitimate services, like drug use or prostitution, gambling, stuff like that. And then there's some sort of a legacy issues historically. That's just how things go that way. So you need to have these things in order to maintain a territorial-based criminal organization. But once the organization takes root in a community, doesn't matter what city you look at, what they want is status quo. They want things remain the same so they can take advantage of all the fringe demands, structural deficiencies to enable itself to exist. That's organized crime. Organized crime, what I consider, is really a parasite of the mainstream society. It takes advantage of the inadequacies of the societies, fringe demands, to enable itself to survive. And violence, yes, is used, probably erupted in great numbers in some circumstances, but usually it's for specific functional reasons, to solve a specific problem, either to get rid of competition or to discipline its own members. And for terrorist groups, their interest is the entire opposite of the organized crime. Organized crime wants to maintain the status quo. You don't want social change. If you want a social change, there will be no business for you. But terrorist groups, at least in our common discussion, ask exactly for the opposite. They want social change. They have specific political, philosophical agenda. And what they do, as opposed to what organized crime groups do is to seek as much attention, do things that would accomplish as much symbolic significance as possible. And the organizational goal for a terrorist group is to bring about social change and not monetary gains. And yet they do use illicit markets because they want to survive as an economic entity. They have to spend money, they have to pay people. Like the ISIS, they still have to use the legal markets to sell oil, to sell whatever stuff that they robbed from other people. So they do need to use illicit markets, illicit channels for sustenance and operational requisites. They want to send people, for instance, using smuggling routes to send their members to different parts of the world in order to carry out missions. But as an organization, they are diametrically different from organized crime. My argument is that they are very different things. If there's any nexus between the two, it's purely accidental and not intentional. Does that make sense? It's my argument. No?
I would say I think you were correct in the characterization you give of the two organizations, two groups. However, from our perspective in protecting the United States, we're concerned about not a terrorist group establishing itself in the United States or in Mexico, attempting to overthrow Mexico. We're concerned about terrorist organizations using the illicit networks that are established by the organized crime and the ungoverned space and the operational environment that is created by those as a means of infiltrating the United States. So
exactly.
It's a very narrow perspective or a very narrow concern about the terrorist groups.
Yeah, that's true. They would not collaborate deliberately. In other words, they probably, if anything, organized criminal probably would run away if they know these are terrorist groups.
Turn them in.
Right, they'll turn them in.
Seek favor with the government.
Exactly.
However, a terrorist group is not going to come in, or a terrorist operative is not going to come in saying, I'm a terrorist operative, I'm going to blow up the Sears building.
Exactly. That's why I'm arguing it's really an accidental partner, because organized crime groups, whether it's drug traffickers or human smugglers, they're not going to do background checks. They're not going to question who you are, where you're from, what's your political agenda. It's a business. If you pay me money, I transport stuff. It's a weapon or drugs, whatever. If you pay me, I'll send the stuff over. If you have someone you want me to smuggle into the U.S., as long as you pay me, I'll do it. So I don't do background checks. I just do it. So in other words, that's true in terms of law enforcement strategy, which is really, like you mentioned, really need to carefully examine and guard and fight this dark and black, in other words, dark economy. So the channels that can be exploited by criminal organizations. But there's really, it's not like they're going to collaborate deliberately, but they will use, just like anyone else, will use the legal services that are available. And that's where, we should really pay attention. Yeah. But that's, whether it's a terrorist groups or anyone else, we're fighting that just the same. Because, it can be exploited by the ordinary citizens. They want to send drugs and weapons, and it could also be exploited by terrorist groups. So in that sense, it makes no difference. It's an equal opportunity merchant in that black economy.
So,
go ahead.
Essentially, you got terrorist groups who are driven by ideology. You got organized crime driven by profit, but they share the same Walmart, if you will, for weapons and other resources, logistics, etc., that they can gain elsewhere.
Exactly. Yeah, they can go to the black market and buy weapons and buy whatever, and deal drugs, give you drugs in exchange for weapons. Yeah, that's the sector that we really, in terms of law enforcement, we should really look for, as opposed to looking for their collaboration. Somehow terrorist groups will infiltrate organized crime and collaborate with them, partner them with, to overthrow a government. If anything, historically, if you look at the organized crime history, you're more likely to find governments collaborate with organized crime groups to accomplish certain goals, especially to control certain, low-level business activities, as opposed to collaborating, organized crime group collaborating with any terrorist groups. I mean, if you look at historical records, that's always the case. So we want to differentiate between whether these two groups will collaborate on purpose, form partnership, or they're just, being taken advantage of or being used. In this case, the organized crime groups being used by terrorist groups, just like anyone else. pay the money, send my stuff. So, does that make sense? I know I'm treading on dangerous water now, so you guys will probably, that's not the case. Right.
Thank you. So, I think I'm trying to go in about 10 minutes to bring this back to the border, because again, this is what we spend doing in academia, right? We come up with our models and we come up with things that make sense to us, but then of course we go back to the border and we say, this is what is happening here, and this is how we are experiencing it here. So there were, several things that let me just go over real quick right here on how, just kind of a quick overview. Again, I know that you are aware of, let me go right here, some of the factors. But I think we can, I think it would be really useful for us to bring it back again to the discussion of human smuggling, human smuggling and some of those processes. And I am also going to, when I was listening to the exchange that was that you were having, again, this is most of my work has been primarily with human smuggling. But what I remember from the experience looking at organized crime in Europe and how it has been, in a sense, tried to the attempts that have been made to bring it to the Mexican and the Latin American experience has been, it's not even useful at times to talk about, how are we talking about control? And I think it's Federico Varese, the one who's also talking about, are we fighting for control of the authorities? Which I think is what, it keeps coming up. It's not about, they already know the routes, and there is a knowledge that people share, right? It's kind of what I was saying earlier. Like, they get the calls. Who can use what route and when they can't. There is this knowledge of who owns which route, who is allowed to use that route, and under what circumstances. And of course, and what are the consequences, of using them. So I think also a useful concept when we talk about organized crime is to also think who is having access to what kind of presidentes municipales. What I'm trying to think, it was, presidentes municipales, la Policía Federal, la Policía Local, Policía Municipal, in the case of Mexico. There is always something that we haven't really discussed here, and that I think it's also, worth examining, the level of potential misconduct within American agencies, and where we see and where we can track some of that level of collaboration. Let me see, what there was something else that I wanted to say. Violence. And we are, we see, or we have learned to think when we talk about the kinds of violence that we see in human smuggling. Are they similar or are they different to the ones that we see in drug trafficking? They are different? You're answering all the questions, I think. Anyone else? How are they different?
I think the drug traffickers are much more trigger happy. Easier to they're much quicker to resort to violence than are human traffickers.
Okay.
There could be an orchestration because they control a lot of media. They're putting out their brand, if you will, versus you want to be more discreet in the smuggling, I would imagine.
Okay. Anyone else? Specific examples of smuggling violence? And this is one, I think this was also something that I really wanted to talk about it in the discussion, because as Sheldon spoke or mentioned earlier, violence is so specific. Like, why would you want to attract attention? We see that level of interest. We see that level of crimes in the Mexican case, right? That's I remember actually when I was a grad student and when Sheldon sent me to Michoacan, the day right after I arrived, it was when they found that pile of bodies without heads. You remember that tragic day? I remember it because I had to hitchhike all the way on that highway. And, when the lady stopped by, "Estás loca, mija? Like, you're crazy, what are you doing hitchhiking along this way?" So violence has this very specific has a very specific angle. It is hardly ever random.
I want to throw the question at you. So now that I have an answer, I've been struggling with this question a lot. Is that why there's so much violence in Mexico? And this is the level of violence you don't witness in other parts of the world. When we do comparative analysis, if you look at the Sicilian Mafia, the Hong Kong Triads, the Yakuza in Japan, even the Russian Mafia, when they use violence, it was usually very targeted. High-level government officials, a prosecutor back in the early 1990s, Falcone, for instance, a prosecutor in Sicily was killed. So when they do use violence, it's usually for a very specific purpose, not as widespread, as loud, as sensational as was in Mexico.
Any explanation? You look at Europe, you look at organized crime in Europe, the history there, or even the Yakuza or whatever, I mean, it's so much deeper, and when you talk about organized crime in that fashion, those are, the IBMs of the world, and they've been there forever, and they're very structured and very disciplined in what they do. In Mexico, and what you see in South and Latin America, and this is why even your territorial versus the distributorship, they're very young.
Okay.
You compare them, right? And
so your argument is they're sort of like amateurs.
No, they're not.
Compared to, because
no, I would say they were less mature. They're less mature in the business process than the other ones.
Because if you look at the organized crime literature across the world, they do business quietly. Violence oftentimes is implied, so you better behave. Very rarely actually used, unless for very desperate, really for major causes. So you make money by doing quiet things. You can use implied violence, but mostly you pay money. You use money to smooth your operations.
Those are very controlled environments.
Right.
So,
but in Mexico, it was just loud, sensational. It just attracts attention. It's not good for business.
But it's good for influence, right? It's good for you to retain your ability to influence. And then when you look at the criminal states, say like Venezuela, or you look at some ungoverned states or other people, accusations of ungoverned states in South America, in Europe, you're talking about legitimate states and people operating within those and filling those gaps you're talking about. That's very different when you go to ungoverned and criminal states. So you're going to see a different dynamic played out. So I think it's an unfair comparison.
I don't have a. I mean, it's not
apples and oranges.
I just trying to understand why there's so much violence. Why was so much violence needed to accomplish whatever you needed to do? It's certainly not good for business.
I think a lot of it was the psychological makeup of the traffickers and that impunity that we referred to earlier. We saw situations in Juarez where scouts were watching areas. If they saw somebody suspicious, they would check to see if they were on their side. If they weren't, the order was given to kill them. Simply because I wasn't on your team.
In my experience,
I'm sorry, there was somebody else here first, and then we'll go back here. Yeah, go ahead.
There was a major political shift too in Mexico with the PRI, which sort of had tabs on organized crime. All of a sudden you got the PAN, who's less experienced, at least 70 years of not being in office, how to control this phenomenon of relationship that should be in the dark, but you open up powers to the states and stuff, so it becomes much more complex.
So there was this agreement, if you remember this during the 80s, and for most of the time that the PRI was in power. The agreements that have been very much in place and that were very well known, that allowed for drug trafficking organizations to operate nationwide without pretty much uninterrupted, in collaboration with, again, we go back with the state. So we had a very strong state institution that had been in power for over 70 years. We had, or Mexico had a president, of course, but this president had, was being anointed by the one that was exiting. So we had a very stable system that never forced any kind of changes in the organization of drug trafficking organizations. So, as Jose points out, and most of you know here in the room, this transition altered the makeup of the organizations. So right now, what we're dealing with, and I think that is one of the, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but we have so many organizations, or the Mexican authorities have so many organizations that have to deal with so many groups, that is really not, having a unified strategy is not possible. And more than anything, there's an unwillingness that we see on the part of the Mexican state to develop any kind of changes. So, in this context, we again see violence. And as you mentioned, it is not any just kind of violence. It's very specific. You had a comment.
Yeah. Growing up in the border fence, I also grew up over by Brownsville. And when I was a teenager, I would go across, and there was no problem going across, coming back. And I'm pretty sure drugs was also crossing, but like I said, maybe somebody was in power, somebody was in control of all that area. So it wasn't a problem for us to go shop, go eat, come back. There was no problem. But when that person got out of power, there's two groups that want to come in now and want to take charge of it, and that's why they're fighting, because both of them want to be in charge of that area that nobody agrees on who's going to be in charge, and that's why there's a lot of violence, and they're killing each other, and they don't care. If they're going to shoot each other, they'll kill innocent people around, and that's why the violence is there, because nobody can be in charge right now.
Thank you. Any other? There were a couple of comments. No. Yeah.
I was just going to say that you're asking, as far as I'm understanding your question, why is violence so much more out in the media, or why is it so much known or seen in Mexico as compared to other countries? And one of the aspects or factors to consider is the prosecution rate in Mexico is, I think it's like less than 2% of people that get convicted ever get prosecuted. They don't. Even the prisons. Prisons are cluttered. They're overpopulated. So it's not unheard of for us to come across reporting that says, hey, this guy was arrested, last month, and now he's operating again. So even if they do get convicted, they're out there. So the point I'm making is they don't care, because they're never going to be held accountable through their justice system. Their justice system is pretty bad, and this administration that they have now has attempted to do, sort of reform their justice system and implementing certain things like getting their public a little bit more informed, giving them access to a similar system that we have here for 911, making the process of reporting human rights violations or certain crimes easier on the public. But a lot of those policies and strategies are catered not necessarily to the people, the poor people, but to the people that have access to TV, to radio, to communication. A lot of people in Mexico don't have that.
And I think that is where I'm going to bring, again, we're going to go back to kind of where we started this morning. This is where social scientists can jump in and help. Because many times we have all of these images. There's this tide of images and representations that are very much connected to the border, to drug trafficking, to human smuggling. When I said earlier La Bestia, everybody went like, yeah, La Bestia. Everybody knows it. It's again like when I said telenovelas to when this guy brought out the telenovelas in Africa. So there are very specific messages that are modelized in connection to human smuggling and to drug trafficking. But as you mentioned earlier, what does that mean to the ones who live on the border? To those of us who grew up seeing these things, who have to deal with them on a day-to-day basis, not only because it's part of our work, but it's also because they are part of our personal interactions with one another. Again, we go, I keep bringing up the TAP, but we go there and we know that they have a very diverse clientele, right? And we know the kinds of conversations. I remember I know that you're here with us from Arizona. Anybody else from Arizona? Restaurant El Indio in Tucson. Look, I love going there for caldo de queso, right? I was always there. And then, somebody told me, you don't want to go there. I'm like, why not? It's a great place. And the ladies always call me mija. I'm like, don't go there. But there is, again, since that was the place where a lot of the deals that were connected to drug trafficking were taking place. Why am I bringing this up? Again, as an anthropologist, I am very much interested in these day-to-day interactions that are so essential to intelligence gathering, that are so crucial to the way we interpret that information. I'll give you another story in terms of violence, and here I am going to be connecting it. So one of the cases that I had a chance to be part of involved, talk about transnational, a group of coyotes that were actually of Cuban origin. It was a very significant, about 15 Cuban nationals, including 2 women, who were involved in human smuggling in Arizona. If you have heard our fellow Cubans and the kind of Spanish that they speak, you can pretty much have an idea that it really doesn't sound like fronterizo Spanish. And so those guys were on the wiretaps fighting each other, while they were holding the people on both sides of the safe houses because they could not figure out what each other was saying. And so, the Cuban would hang up and call his girlfriend. I can do a Cuban impersonation, but I can do a norteña very well. And here you're going to, again, pardon my Spanish. Es hijo de la chingada, no entiendo ni madres, güey. No sé lo que me está diciendo. That son of a bitch, I have no idea what he's saying. He talks too fast. And you can imagine what the guy was telling to the Cuban guy was telling to the girlfriend. They were not communicating. This was, in turn, having an impact on the safety of the people who were staying at the safe houses, whose families had already been reported the cases to CBP. I'm sure that many of you have been involved or have heard about rescue, cases involving kidnappings, with the bajadores of the stash houses. What do you think? What do you guys think brought them together to collaborate? What would bring a Cuban? This sounds like a joke, but what would bring what would bring a Cuban and a Mexican to the same table to collaborate? Well, of course, that was actually how they got caught at the end, because there was a raid. There was a raid at a location where some beautiful women were providing services, and law enforcement started to think, what are Cubans doing in Phoenix in the summertime? What could bring 2 people from, even though they are from similar countries that are so different together?
Restaurants.
You're always thinking food. Los gallos. What's a gallo? Cockfighting. One day, these guys had been talking for 45 minutes about a person who hadn't been able to pay her ransom. We're talking about a $3,000 ransom that this woman his family hadn't been able to pay. And they had been fighting about this for 45 minutes. And suddenly, the Mexican guy said, you know what? I have no more time for you. Voy a ver cómo están mis gallos. I'm going to go check how my roosters are doing. There was this, short silence in the line. ¿Tienes gallos? Yeah. So the next 45 minutes were spent, pero déjame te cuento de mi gallo. Let me tell you about mine. No, let me tell you about, this is a great feed for this. Why am I bringing this up? After that, everything went super smoothly. They were talking. They suddenly realized that, they would get 2 Mexicans, to talk to each other. Why are we talking? And they saved their conversations to pretty much talk about, the cockfights. And this, in turn, eased the stay for the people at the safe houses. Because at this point, they really didn't have, if we want to use the word ease, because at this point, they really didn't have to deal or to put up with having to stay at a house where smugglers were not communicating effectively. So I'm again bringing up this example because when we just look at, when we overemphasize violence, and this is something that I actually questioned, among academics, we get so fixated with violence. We are so in love, in a sense, with with the gruesome, with all of the graphic images, that we forget that there are simple ways in which people are communicating and collaborating. And yes, violence is super important in trying to understand how these collaborations take place. But what are they saying about the people, and how can they be translated into security and the safety of the people that they are keeping at the safe houses? Because at the end, that is what we have to deal with on an everyday basis, right? having to go into the safe houses, having to rescue them, having to help out victims, spending nights at the hospitals watching over a victim, or even having to take care of a smuggler. So this is, I think, kind of the contributions that we can provide you as social researchers, the level and the new ways to perhaps to think about some of those interactions, about some of those relations.
Also, I was wondering.
But let me just really quick, and I think we have maybe a couple minutes for questions, Chief.
Sure. Very quickly, from our perspective, the security through the United States, I wonder, what does violence at the border or outside have anything to do with how does it affect our security?
And we go back to, it affects. We can definitely connect it to national security. To some of the what is the kind of who can we prevent from coming across? Who is and I think a lot of the questions that keep coming up among law enforcement is like how do we better protect the border? How do we screen people who are trying to come across better to prevent the commission of criminal acts? So that is one of the questions. But then I think we go back to what we were saying earlier in terms of definitions. What do we define as violence? How do each one of you, working out there understands violence, and how do you have to deal with violence on an everyday basis? Any questions? Oh.
Can I? Because sorry, I rarely get to have the opportunity to see so many folks in one place. So can I throw another question at you? That is something I've been struggling with.
Very limited time.
Very limited time. So very quickly, we do notice in the last few years, in talking to undocumented migrants, we've noticed quite an overlap, emergent overlap between human trafficking and drug trafficking in the last few years. Whereas traditionally these two are run on separate tracks. Drug traffickers, do their own businesses that they rarely run into or to run business together with human traffickers and human smugglers. And now the human smugglers we see a lot of overlap between the two. Can some of you tell me what's going on? What are the factors behind this emerging overlapping between these two previously separate businesses?
About the money, about the money that's both up. Both groups have to pay the same people. You just gotta follow the flow of the money as it travels all the way up.
Wait, the money is being siphoned out from certain sectors, and they force them to overlap now. I mean, there has to be for some reason they want to overlap.
I think the groups have become less centralized over the years, and they become more decentralized and more cell-based and structure-based, right? And when you do that, you decentralize. People have the freedom to engage in all kinds of commodities. So instead of trying to focus on a commodity driving, an organization, you have an organization just shopping out whatever commodities they can find.
So they become less specialized, whereas in the past they specialized in drug trafficking.
The commodity, they have they'll smuggle widgets, Volvos, humans, fentanyl, whatever, it doesn't matter. Their specialization is the ability to move. It
is quite, although shipping human beings are quite different enterprise from shipping drugs. They require very different requisites.
But the routes are the same?
I was hoping you guys would tell me, because you guys are doing such a good job. You closed down a lot of crossing points, and you minimize the tracks that they can work together. You force these groups to work together. That was one of my hypothesis. So because the border hardening has significantly increased after 9/11, you increase the cost of operations in a lot of sectors, and you force these two otherwise separate entities together now because there are fewer routes to cross the border. They inevitably run into each other. And since they are identifiable now, noticed in the same territories, creates opportunity for the territorial-based criminal organizations to levy a fee. Whereas in the past, you have entire 2,000-some miles with so many places you can cross. Does that sound like a reasonable hypothesis? That border hardening reduces the amount of space that you can operate and force these two entities to run into each other. Is that?
Well, I think hardening the border certainly is a factor. I think the other factor is that the drug traffickers, they're diversified, saw opportunity for profit, another profit center, if you will, in human smuggling. And a couple of years ago, particularly in the Tamaulipas, South Texas area, with all the unaccompanied children coming in, we saw the traffickers taking advantage of, the drug traffickers taking advantage of that activity and the profit that they could generate out of it. And they were encroaching on the human smuggling activity for profit.
But there has always been human smugglings, but in the past, for ages, drug traffickers never crossed with human smugglers.
The hardening of the border has caused the price per human to go up, so now it's profitable.
Now it's more profitable.
Ah, so in the past, it was just so little money, drug traffickers then couldn't care less or didn't bother.
As a drug trafficker, if you're able to direct each, you're able to say, okay, we're going to send human smugglers now as a diversion across this area, so that it'll tie up the Border Patrol assets, and then we'll use our drugs coming around this way.
So still, there's a consequences of border hardening.
Those people who are apprehended, well, a lot of them will be repatriated back to Mexico, so that I get to get them again, or they get to try again.
That was the case, yeah. I talked to undocumented migrants in San Diego during my study, and the 3 times he attempted to cross border, each time he was asked to carry a backpack as part of the payment. But I think fundamentally the main instigator, the main reason behind the overlap was really caused by border hardening. You're making the cost gone up. It's also, if the cost goes up, makes the human smuggling profitable enough for the drug traffickers to get over. Thank you. That helped me clarify.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
At this point, I would like to remind you about the postfix. If you can kindly fill that for me. There's a great deal of value notes on that, as well as the exit survey. The exit survey, I'm asking for canned responses on that. And if you think of topics, it doesn't have to be related to this. Topics that are of interest to you, what you work on that, put it on there, and I'll see what I can do. I'm going to ask that Mr. Vasquez will be out here to handle his exit survey pre and post test. And Ms. Leonor Ortega will take those also. And the El Paso PD and the Utah PD, you will see Ms. Diaz, and she'll get you the Tico bread. Thank you.
Thank you. And once again, if there's anything, that UTEP as an institution can do, for you, please let us know. Again, either, you can talk to Manjarrez, to myself. I'm really happy to see several people that I've met here over the last few months. And, they can also tell you that we are very much interested in developing partnerships with all of you. Thank you so much.